Thank you, President O'Donnell, for that very kind and generous introduction. I appreciate it. It is really great to be here at Christendom. I've known many people who have studied here, and I've known professors here, and I've known also alumni, and I've always been impressed with these people. This is such a great place, and it's such a special place. It's one of the best colleges in the entire country, so it is with great gratitude that I'm be able to stand here and speak with you today. And I'm going to speak to you today about the 7 big myths about the Catholic Church. And sometimes when I give a talk like this, people say, why 7? And, it could be 13 and things. And I'm not denying that. You're right. There's more than just the things I'm talking about. But I want to talk about 7. And I want to start with someone I'm sure you're all familiar with. Bishop Fulton Sheen once said, "There are not more than 100 people in the world who truly hate the Catholic Church, but there are millions who hate what they perceive to be the Catholic Church." So I want to count down from number 7. This is like a American's Top 40 countdown. So from number 7 all the way to number 1. And I'll start off with number 7, the myth number 7. And the myth is that the Church opposes science. And I remember, this was a while ago now, just after I graduated from college, I returned to my home, Seattle, and I went running with a great friend of mine. We were really good friends in high school. We ran together, and I actually lived with him in the summer in college. And we were running around Green Lake, and we'd done this many, many times. And he was, kind of confiding in me and saying, "I just don't know what to do. I just broke up with this young woman, and I thought we were going to get married maybe, and it didn't work out. And I'm teaching school, and I just don't feel like this is a really good place for me to teach anymore." And he just was kind of in a moment of crisis, a kind of turning point. And I said to him, "Gosh, I'm really sorry to hear, all these things are in your life. It's lots of difficulties." And I said, well, do you have any way forward? How will you resolve these issues? And he said, "I really don't know what to do." He said, "Well, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, I found in my life that if I really don't know what to do and I'm really struggling, I pray. And when I pray, after a while, I get a sense of, where I should move." And he said, "Well, I can't really do that." I said, "Well, why can't you do that?" He said, "Well, I don't believe in God anymore." I said, "Wow, you don't believe in God anymore? I mean, your family raised you Catholic, come from this great Italian background, and you went to a Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, and you don't believe in God anymore? Why?" He said, "Well, I had, science courses at the University of Washington, and, now I don't believe in God." And he thought somehow that science and faith are opposed. He had never heard maybe of Blaise Pascal, the devout Catholic who was the founder of mathematical theory of probabilities. He'd never heard of Grégoire Mendel, the founder of modern genetics, or Nicholas Copernicus, or Louis Pasteur, or Alexander Fleming, or Georges Lemaître, who was the Belgian physicist who first put forward the Big Bang theory of the universe. He thought somehow that to be a person of faith and to accept the findings of science were mutually exclusive. And it made me really sad. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about, to write this book, is to dispel these kind of myths that people like my friend had. The reality is this, that faith and reason, as you well know, work together. And there is ultimately no contradiction between anything that's a truth of faith and any truth that we can find in science. And the Church, therefore, has always, from the very beginning, supported science. All Catholic universities in the world have departments of science, and even the cathedrals in Bologna and Florence, Paris, and Rome were designed in the 17th and 18th centuries to function as world-class solar observatories. Now, the reason faith and reason work together is that God is the author, really, of 2 books, the book of nature and the book of Revelation. And because God is purest truth, and because God is pure goodness, God can't contradict what God says in one book in the other book. And we know that the eternal word, the Logos, is the basis, not just of theology, but is also of psychology and biology and anthropology and geology, and the reasoned study of any field of knowledge. So faith and reason work together. And in the question and answer period, maybe we can talk about some of the alleged contradictions, Genesis, for instance, being the prime example. But let me move on to the sixth big myth. And this is that the church is opposed to women. The church hates women. Famously in politics, right, some politicians speak of the war on women, and certainly in their view, they think of the Catholic Church as part of this so-called war on women. Now, we have to admit that when we look back at history, there are definitely Catholics who have not done everything they can do and should have done in terms of how they treated women. But if we look at how Jesus interacted with women, we can see really the model for all Christians. So think of Jesus interacting with the Samaritan woman at the well, right? She was a Samaritan, so Jews weren't supposed to have anything to do with them to start with. And she is a woman, and men didn't meet with women. And Jesus meets her when? At noon. She's out there in the heat of the day, right? Now, why is that? Well, some interpreters of the gospel say that that's the time where no one wanted to be out, right? Because it's hot and you have to carry the water back, and it's the worst time to go and be outside in the blazing sun. So she goes out there, and Jesus, of course, treats her with respect, with kindness, and the woman goes away from Jesus really transformed, right? She becomes really one of the first evangelists, telling everyone that she meets that Jesus is the Messiah. Think about Jesus' interaction with the woman caught in adultery, right? Let the one without sin cast the first stone. Think about how Jesus arranged that women were the first to encounter the risen Christ. So if we look at the actions of Jesus, if we look also at the teachings of Jesus, we find nothing but respect. Think about, for instance, Jesus' teaching on divorce. Divorce in the modern world often causes women grave suffering, but in the ancient world, it was even more true. And Jesus insisted that both men and women have an equality in the demands of unconditional love, that both men and women have the same vows, and that both men and women are called to fidelity, not just women, but also men. Now, of course, sometimes Christians fail to imitate the example of Jesus, both in terms of this issue and other issues. But the church has continued to insist, for instance, on the equality of man and woman, for instance, in the area of ethics and morals. There's no double standard in church teaching, as if, well, it's okay for men to commit adultery, but not women. It's okay for men to do this or that, but not women. The church calls all of us, male and female alike, to the same high moral standard. And we find the church also serving women in very radical and important ways. Think, for example, of how many women receive health care in Catholic hospitals, how many women receive an education in Catholic grade schools, Catholic high schools, and Catholic colleges. How many women are in charge of these institutions, right? In charge of the hospitals, in charge of the colleges. So you have the church serving women, you have women serving the church. This is unthinkable in an institution that really opposed some group. I mean, think about the KKK. How many, African Americans do you think the KKK serves, in their hospitals and whatever? Well, none, of course. How many black people are in charge of the KKK in any capacity? 0, of course. And what about the fifth biggest myth? And that, I think, is that the church opposes happiness. There's a myth that the church is kind of indifferent to happiness and thinks about, yes, we get this life here on earth, and then we have, pie in the sky later. And that there's such a focus on the afterlife that the church really doesn't care about the earthly suffering of people. I think Pope Francis here has done much in his own person to dispel this sort of view, that the church is indifferent to suffering and doesn't really care. Think about this question, and you might know the answer. If you look worldwide, who serves the most people in a concrete, material, here and now way? Which institution worldwide runs more schools than the church does? Which institution worldwide runs more hospitals than the church, or orphanages, or old folks' home, or cares for more immigrants, or cares for more homeless people, or feeds more people? The church does more than any other government, any other institution in the history of the world to help people in need here and now, in need in a physical kind of way. And then what about non-physical needs? Well, think about how the church supplies our needs that go beyond the needs of the body, not just the corporal works of mercy, but also the spiritual works of mercy. I wrote a book called The Gospel of Happiness. It talks about the intersection of the church's teaching about how to gain happiness and the findings of contemporary psychology that buttress those teachings. So, for instance, at dinner I was mentioning that there was interesting research about suicide. And what the research showed is that if you look at the United States, the fewest number of people kill themselves on one day, and that one day is Thanksgiving Day, right? The suicide rate in the United States drops to its lowest point in the whole year. So think about how the church encourages us to be thankful people. So we as Catholics are very lucky because we do not have Thanksgiving Day just once a year in November. Really, we have Thanksgiving Day every Sunday or even more often because every Mass, every Eucharist, which is just the Greek term for Thanksgiving, is an opportunity, a chance to really give thanks. And think about the very last words that are said at every single Mass, right? Thanks be to God. It's those words of thanks that the church sends us out into the world with so that we can look around at our own lives and think about all the many, many blessings that each one of us has. The contemporary psychologist also found that many people are much less happy than they would be because of greed. That is to say, they love money excessively and end up undermining their own happiness. And again, think about the wisdom of the church on this matter, right? Warning people against the god of mammon, warning people not to make a god out of money. Another finding the contemporary psychologist found had to do with the importance of forgiveness. That forgiveness, they said, is one of the most important virtues that we can have, because without forgiveness, we really can't have any long-term relationships. And again, maybe you've heard a word or two about forgiveness in the church, coming straight from Jesus, right? Right in the heart of the Our Father. So the church is not at all indifferent to earthly suffering in a physical way or earthly suffering in a non-physical way, in a spiritual way. What about the fourth biggest myth? And that would be that the church hates gays and lesbians. It's a myth of Catholic homophobia or inaction against AIDS and HIV. The reality, of course, is that the church takes its cue from the teachings of Jesus. And the teachings of Jesus could not be more clear that we're called to love all human beings. We're called to love everyone, even our enemies, even people who hate us. We're called to love everyone. And the church showed this love in its response to the crisis of AIDS and HIV in the gay community. And it showed the love in part by insisting that the proper context for sexual relations is the marriage of one man and one woman in fidelity. And Edward Green, he was the director of the Harvard's AIDS Prevention Project. He did studies of AIDS in Africa. And basically what the studies showed is that those countries that adopted the church's understanding, that is to say that promoted abstinence before marriage and fidelity in marriage, those countries had much lower rates of AIDS and HIV infection than did countries that just pushed condoms. Say a word about the third biggest myth now, and that's that the church opposes same-sex marriage because of bigotry. As the Supreme Court said in the Windsor decision, limiting marriage to one man and one woman is bigotry because its sole purpose is, quote, to demean and humiliate same-sex couples. Now, this, I think, is, again, quite unfair. The reality of limiting marriage to one man and one woman has nothing whatsoever to do with putting down same-sex couples, any more than limiting marriage to two people. The point of that is to put down or to demean couples that want polygamy. It just doesn't have anything to do with that. And it's very, very hard to believe, and I don't think anyone really does believe, that President Obama, President Clinton, and the majority of Americans are, or were until a short time ago, all really bigots. They all really hate every gay person or something. The reality is that limiting marriage to one man and more women has nothing to do with bigotry, but has everything to do with how we understand what marriage is. So is marriage an institution that's simply ordered to satisfying whatever desires the two people or three people or four people happen to have? Or is marriage, is the point of marriage really not about just the two people, but about more than the two people? It's about the two people to begin with, but also the children that those two people may create. So marriage, in other words, is about a comprehensive union between two people. And because only a man and a woman can be comprehensively united not just in terms of emotions or not just in terms of desires, but united even in a physical bodily way. Indeed, united in the most comprehensive way possible, so comprehensive that it actually can create a new human life. Marriage is about that kind of union. And again, that does not mean that other kinds of relationships, we need to hate them or or cause trouble for them. It's not about that, but it's about recognizing the unique value of this union between a man and a woman. We're getting close to the second biggest myth now, and that is posed by a guy named Judge Richard Posner, and he wrote that the problem of priests sexually molesting boys would be solved if priests were allowed to marry. Now, the idea, in other words, would be that the crisis of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church was brought about by and caused by celibacy, right, that priests don't marry. But the reality, of course, is that marriage does not cure and does not prevent the sexual abuse of minors. One of the most famous examples of this is Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Sandusky. So they've been married since 1966, but that marriage did nothing whatsoever to stop or prevent or cure Jerry Sandusky's abuse of minors. And in fact, the research shows quite clearly that married men are just as likely as celibate priests to sexually abuse children. If you look at the rates of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, they have no relationship whatsoever to priestly celibacy. So for instance, in the early 50s, you had almost no cases of sexual abuse of minors. And then basically the numbers rise over the course of the 60s and reach a peak in the early 70s, and then basically begin to decline again and then go almost to zero in contemporary times. So you have this kind of bell curve, right? But the whole time, right, in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and today, priestly celibacy was a discipline of the church. So there's just no relationship at all between priestly celibacy and the sexual abuse of minors. The research done after the crisis showed that celibacy does not drive people to sexual abuse. In fact, Catholic clergy are no more likely to engage in sexual abuse than other clergy or non-Catholic clergy. We also have evidence from insurance companies. So when insurance companies insure Catholic priests, there's no difference in the insurance that they provide versus insurance provided for others. And insurance companies, of course, make their living off the probabilities, the likelihood of things happening. What we find in the sexual abuse of minors today is the almost non-existence of these cases. So in 2011, there were only 7 credible cases of sexual abuse in the entire United States. So that's about 68 million people. In 2009, there were only 6 credible cases. And the answer to the sexual abuse problem, both then and today, has to do with 3 things: fidelity, fidelity, and fidelity. Right? First of all, fidelity of the priests in actually living out the teachings of the church. Every priest knows these teachings and is called to live in a continent way. And if they do, there's no problem. Also, fidelity of the bishops, though, of protecting the flock and also ensuring proper discipline for their priests. And then finally, fidelity in the formation of priests. So there was a time when Catholic seminaries did not do a very good job at forming people in terms of how to live a celibate life. But now, thank goodness, they do a much better job. So what, in my view, is the biggest myth of all? The biggest myth of all, I think, is that the church is indifferent to love, and therefore the church banned contraception. I think of all the church's teachings, I think probably the most controversial, the most difficult for contemporary people to understand is the church's teaching on contraception. So what I want to do is talk about why I think the church does teach what it teaches on this area. So imagine people were skeptical about the value of private property, right? They just couldn't quite see why it was important. It would be very hard to show them that stealing was wrong, right? Or imagine people were very skeptical and couldn't see the value in being truthful. Well, it'd be very hard to see why the church teaches what it teaches about lying. So I think unless we get clear on the value of procreation, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for people to understand why the church teaches what it does about contraception. So let's talk about procreation a little bit. I want to propose to you that having children is a good, in part because it not only doesn't contradict love, but actually enhances love. So love, of course, is an ambiguous term. What I mean is it can be used in different senses. So let's talk about the sense of love, meaning in the sense of eros, erotic love. So erotic love can be self-defined in different ways. So let's draw on the understanding of erotic love, which you may be familiar with already, the understanding that Plato talks about in the Symposium. I'm thinking of the speech of Aristophanes. You guys remember that from your reading? So the speech of Aristophanes is probably the most famous speech in the symposium. And Aristophanes proposes that originally human beings had a different shape than we do now. Originally we were like circle people, right? So rather than just 2 arms, we had 4 arms. Rather than 1 face, we had 2 faces. Rather than 2 legs, 4 legs. And basically what happened was the circle people rebelled against the gods, and so Zeus and the gods cut them in half. And then we gain the shape we have now, right? Just 2 arms, just 2 legs, and 1 face. But what happened as a result was that people were drawn to their other half, the half that was missing, right? And he said, and Aristophanes says, well, that's the origin of love. That's why we have erotic love. We were drawn to our other half. We want to reconnect and be reunited with our lost half. And we talk about our spouses sometimes in this way, right? You say, my better half, right? That's kind of the idea Aristophanes was getting at. So if we understand erotic love in this way, you can see why procreation is a great good. Because if the goal of erotic love is to be as united as you can be with someone else, to be as united as you can be with someone else involves what? The maximum unity would be to be physically united with them in the act of sexual intercourse. But even a greater unity in a way is to actually have a child with a person, right? Each one of us, in a way, is a walking monument to the unity that existed at one point between our mother and our father. So if we think about erotic love as this drive for unity with the other, that unity is actually created in each one of us. But what about if we think about love as friendship? One of the greatest discussions of friendship ever, and again, you may have read this before, is Aristotle's discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. And there he famously distinguishes between 3 different kinds of friends. Remember, he talks about friends of pleasure. Right? The idea there is people that you just like to have fun with, go drink beer with or something. Friends of utility. The idea there is friends that you both get something out of it. So maybe that your friend has a car, so friend drives you around, and then you pay for the gas. So you're getting the ride, and he's getting the gas money, right? So your friend's based on that. But the third, and the very best kind of friendship for Aristotle, he called a friendship of virtue. And a friendship of virtue is where it's not what the person's giving you that you really care about. It's that the person's character, the person's inner goodness is really what unites you, what you really appreciate about the other person. Now, Aristotle had no idea about the infused virtues that Aquinas talked about. So for Aristotle, the only way to get a virtue is by repeated action. Now think about what happens to a husband and wife when they have a child. Baby's born, very vulnerable, very dependent. And so both the mother and the father are called to help that baby survive, right? To feed the baby, to get diapers, to be up burping the baby, to do all those things that good parents do. And when they do those things, what's happening to them? Well, each person who does that is growing in virtue. Why? Because they're doing over and over again patient, kind, generous actions. And the more children they have, the more opportunities they have to do these kind, patient, generous, good actions. They grow, in other words, more and more and more and more virtuous. So if we thought about just a friendship of pleasure, you could say, well, procreation is really not valuable. If you really think that the point of life is just to have kicks, have a good time, get drunk or something, well, of course, kids don't really add to that. If you thought about the purpose of life is just having lots of money or just lots of power or lots of fame or something, well, kids aren't really going to contribute to that very much. But if you thought about a friendship of virtue in the way Aristotle did, you can see how having kids would greatly enhance people's virtues, both people's virtues. And I know in my life this is true. Before I had kids, it was very easy for me to be critical of my own parents, right? Because you look at mom and dad and you say, oh, you did this wrong and you should have done this right, and I criticize this and that. But once you have kids of your own, it becomes much harder to criticize them because at least I'll speak for myself, I, for the first time, realized how incredibly hard it is to be a good parent. It really is hard. In fact, I couldn't even get my kid in the door before I made my first big mistake. So I'm bringing my first child, Elizabeth, home from the hospital. And I don't know if you don't have kids, you don't know about this, but when you have kids, you have all this gear that comes with kids. You've got like a car seat and a little bag and all this stuff. Anyway, so I'm unloading all the gear. And I get my daughter. She's out of the hospital, and it's first time coming home. They get her out, put her on top of all the gear, and then I grab the last diaper bag, and yes, what happens? She fell off the thing. Yes, it's horrible. She's okay. She falls out. So, she starts crying. I pick up the baby. I didn't even get her in the house before I made a horrible mistake. I mean, this is not good. But, when you make mistakes like that, and every parent here, I'm sure, could say they've made, maybe not as bad as I did, but they've made mistakes too. And you realize, you love the kid like crazy, but you realize how imperfect you are, right? And you realize also, for the very first time sometimes, how much your own parents did for you, right? When you're up at 3 a.m. and walking around and, you realize, wow, my mom and dad did this for me. You have a personal sense of that in a very deep way. And having kids also helps you grow in humility. So some of you know Chris Bloom, who is a professor, a Catholic professor. And when I was at Notre Dame, he was very kind. He invited my wife and I over with our daughter Elizabeth, and I think we had 3 kids at the time, so our 3 little kids, and for Easter. It's really nice. We had beautiful meal, and my eldest daughter was just getting potty trained. And so she comes over to me at one point and says, well, Dad, you have to go to the bathroom. I said, okay, great. I said, well, it's right over there, sweetie. It's just, she walks in there and does her thing, and she comes out, and I say, well, Elizabeth, like, everything okay? You wipe everything? Oh, yeah, Daddy, no problem. Everything's all set. So, I thought I better check. So I go in the bathroom, check, and yeah, she wiped all right. But what she used is the white cashmere sweater of the host. So it didn't exactly work out the way I hoped, but yeah. Now, I'd like to tell you that was the very worst and most embarrassing thing that happened to us, but that wouldn't be true. There was actually another time that was even more, hard to believe, more embarrassing. So this was a little bit later. So we brought George and William, who were, George, the younger boy, was also getting potty trained. So we brought them over to the Jesuit residence. So I'm a professor at LMU, and they have a dining hall where the priests eat. And this was a big deal. I said, boys, this is important. All the priests are going to be there. I want you to have very good manners. I want you to say please and thank you. Don't chew with your mouth full. I want you to be, go over the whole thing. And lunch was great. We have hamburgers. Everything is going great. And then at the end, my son George, he says, well, Daddy, I have to go to the bathroom. I said, okay. But he doesn't know where the bathroom is, so I grab his little hand, and walk, over to where the bathroom is. And I get to the door, and he says, I don't have to go to the bathroom anymore. I said, okay. So we walk back. We're going through all the priests' tables, zigging back and forth. And all of a sudden, I look down, and there's this little trail of little nuggets all the way through the... Oh, no. Oh, my God. It was bad. Now, fortunately, I had tenure already, so that was, that was a relief. But if you have kids, I guarantee it, your kids will humiliate you at one time or another. But this too is really a good thing. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said that every human being has the desire to be God, right? It's an interesting way of thinking about, really, he didn't use the term, but it's really kind of the original sin, right? Adam and Eve, right? If you eat this, you'll be like God. The original sin is to the desire to be God. But when your kids do things like leave a little trail of poop through the Jesuit, or use the cashmere sweater as a toilet paper, you will feel this real humility. You will feel in a visceral way that you're not God. And this, it's good. It's a good thing, though. Children also help reduce the likelihood of divorce. There was a worldwide study done of 49 different countries, and what it found was this, that if a couple has no children at all, the likelihood of divorce is 39%. If a couple has one child, the likelihood of divorce drops to 26%. If a couple has 2 children, the likelihood of divorce drops to 19%. And if a couple has 4 or more children, the likelihood of divorce is less than 3%. Interesting. So Aristotle saw this long ago, that children are a kind of glue that keep the mother and father united to each other. And I know from personal experience, sometimes I get angry with my wife or she gets angry with me and I'll stomp out of the house and walk around the block. And, you're walking around the block and you think, oh, I'm really mad at my spouse, but, Mary needs a bath. I better get back there. And I'm helping Catherine with her algebra, and I probably should do that. And really, it draws you back, right? In fact, when you have kids, you have the strongest possible motivation to love your spouse. You have an additional motivation because this person is not just your husband, not just your wife. This is also the mother of your children. Totally irreplaceable. No one else on planet Earth could possibly be the mother of your children or the father of your children. And sometimes marriages go through tough times, and you need extra motivation to be as good a father, as good a husband, as good a wife, as good a mother as you can be. We all do. And children are part of that motivation, right? Part of what helps you to try to do your very best in terms of being a good spouse. Children also enable you to relive life. So, as a father, I've been so lucky to be able to, for instance, teach my kids how to ride a bike, right? Teach my kids how to read, teach my kids how to swim. I vaguely remember doing these things myself, but to be there with them and get to relive all these great occasions, walk your daughter down the aisle. I got married about 25 years ago, but just this fall I got to walk my daughter down the aisle. What a beautiful, wonderful occasion to relive this wonderful moment in life. But most importantly of all, I'd say children are important because they help us to get to heaven. Jesus said that if you want to get to heaven, you need to obey the commandments. And I think having children really does help us to obey the commandments. We mentioned already how children, in a natural way, help us to be more grateful to our own parents, the kids as grandparents. And think about how much easier it is, therefore, for parents to obey the fourth commandment, right? Honor your father and mother, right? We have a natural way in which having kids helps us to do that. And when your kids humiliate you and do things that you don't want them to do and cause trouble and such, it's easier to obey the first commandment. Because I think sometimes when you don't have kids, it's easy to kind of feel almost as if you're God, right? When you're a little child, it's very easy to know you're not God, right? Your parents decide when you get out of bed, what you eat for breakfast, they decide your whole life. But when you get to be in your 20s, 30s maybe, you don't have any kids, you don't have any responsibilities, you decide everything, right? When you get up, what you eat, what your job is, where you live, what you do, everything's under your control. But when you have kids, wow, you realize very quickly how you do not have total control. For instance, you don't choose, right, whether you have a boy or a girl. And you might say, well, what if you adopt a child? Well, okay, even then, if you have a baby, you don't really choose what that baby is going to be like. Maybe your child is going to be a great athlete, right? Maybe your child is going to be quite clumsy. Maybe your child is going to be incredibly intelligent. Maybe your child's going to have learning disabilities, right? Maybe your child's going to be super popular and be homecoming king, homecoming queen, etc. Maybe your child's not going to have a single date all the way through high school, all the way through college, right? You get what you get. But if you're a good parent, what do? You love your kids anyway. If they're a great athlete, if they're a horrible athlete, if they're popular, if they're not popular, if they're smart, if they have learning disabilities, you love them anyway, right? And having kids helps us, therefore, to obey this first commandment, to realize deep in our bones that we're not God. And once we realize that deep in our bones, that opens the door for the real God. And every parent realizes that deep in their bones because every parent is deeply vulnerable in their children. That is to say, you might have the best career ever, you might be feeling 100%, you might be so great in every dimension, but your kids, when something wrong happens to them, you realize how fragile they are. And you realize you really feel your own vulnerability in your own kids. Finally, think about what Jesus said about in terms of getting to heaven at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Very, very famously, Jesus says that at the end of time, he's going to separate those who go to heaven from those who don't. And he's going to say to the one group, right, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And he'll say to them, come into the kingdom. And then to the other group, he says, what? I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was naked and you didn't clothe me. And I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. And they go off to eternal punishment. And I remember hearing this story when I was a kid. And I was in Mass, I looked around the church, and I thought, everyone here is going to hell. Who does this, right? Who does any of these things? I thought, okay, Mother Teresa will be there. No, that's great. Her sisters will be there. Everyone here is going to hell. But then when I had kids, I realized, you know what? Every good father and every good mother actually does all those things, right? When the baby's hungry, good parents feed the child. When the baby's thirsty, good parents provide that child something to drink. When the baby's naked, good parents clothe that baby. And isn't it true that every child comes into a family as a stranger? You don't really know what you're getting. You don't really know how they're going to turn out, what their personality will be like. You don't really know much about them at all. But what happens? Every good father, every good mother welcomes with love whatever child comes into their family, however strange they may be. So maybe in the last day, the good Lord will look out at many of us. And we weren't Mother Teresa, we weren't, but we were trying to be good fathers and trying to be good mothers. And then the good Lord will say to us, come into my kingdom. So the church's wisdom is that procreation is a great good, that procreation is something that greatly enhances the well-being of both the mother and the father. And I think only after I became a father myself did I really understand that the church was right. So in summary, the 7 big myths. The church opposes science. The church hates women. The church opposes happiness. The church hates gays. The church opposes same-sex marriage because of bigotry. Priestly celibacy causes the sexual abuse of minors. And finally, that love and procreation are opposed. Love and procreation aren't opposed at all. And the reason for that is really grounded in the very nature of God. Right? Think about who God is. God is love, St. John tells us. And what is love? Well, love is something that pours out beyond itself. Even the Father generates the Son, right? And the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit do what? They pour themselves out, as it were, in creation, right? And the love between a husband and a wife is meant to imitate God's love, to pour itself out beyond itself, to give this great gift of life to future generations. Thank you very much.